My name is Mei Chiu. Professionally, I'm a lawyer. So that's my paid work. But in terms of unpaid work, I've been an activist for social justice almost all my life. I'm 55 years old, so that's like several decades of activism. I would say right now I'm mostly involved with the Progressive Chinese of Quebec, which is an organization that fights anti-Chinese racism. And in the past 2 years, I've been very involved with Extinction Rebellion Quebec in their Climate Justice Committee, which is trying to advance climate justice as the spearhead of the struggle to save the world, to save the climate. Well, being a minority in Quebec, I think that we've been forced to fight racism just through being who we are. So we've been fighting, I've been fighting racism all my life, just as a lot of minorities in Quebec. And being also a woman, being a single mom, I've had to live in the intersection of several forms of discrimination. And so so that I would say that would be my main connection to the anti-racism project. And for me, anti-racism has to be intersectional as well. So it's not just purely fighting racism, but fighting class discrimination, fighting gender discrimination, etc. What the COVID-19 crisis has shown us is that it's lifted the cover on so many failings of our social economic system. So in Quebec, the biggest crisis that it lifted was the healthcare crisis, the cuts and underfunding of our public healthcare system, and the damage that it has inflicted was very much revealed through the COVID crisis. And at the same time, the COVID crisis revealed to us the extent of the grievous human rights violations of migrant workers, the right of all Quebecers to housing rights, the rights of every person to a decent income, to a decent standard of living, the rights of Indigenous peoples. And I would say that for the Chinese community, it also revealed the simmering anti-Asian racism that exists in society. So for those of you who are not familiar with Chinese Canadian history, the earliest Chinese immigrants to Canada were brought in to work on the railway. And in 1887, after the railway, the Canadian Pacific Railway was built, on which the country of Canada was founded, the government decided that they didn't need any more Chinese people. And so in order to discourage Chinese immigration, the government passed the first tax on every new Chinese immigrant wanting to come into the country. And at that time, it was a very huge amount for the average person to pay. And despite various efforts to increase the amount of taxes, Chinese people were able to get their money together, pool their money together to continue to bring in their family members. So the governments continued to increase the head tax for all Chinese immigrants until 1923. And on July 1st, 1923, which is also known as Humiliation Day in the Chinese community, the Canadian government passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which forbade all Chinese immigrants with very few exceptions, period. And of course, this devastated and stunted the growth of the Chinese community in Canada for over a decade. And the Exclusion Act was not appealed until 1947. So in the 80s, after the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms was passed, a head taxpayer said, well, now the charter means that I'm an equal citizen. I'm an equal Canadian. I have equal rights. So he went to his deputy and said, can I have the money back that I paid for the head tax? And so this galvanized the entire Chinese community across the country to begin a movement for redress and reparations. And finally, it was won in 2006 when Stephen Harper gave a partial redress and official apologies to the Chinese community for the head tax campaign. And so, you know, the community was, people who were cut out of the deal were disappointed, but I think by and large, the community saw that as a victory. And so activism dwindled down a little bit. However, this only meant that explicit direct discrimination was redressed in part. And like any other minority in Canada and Quebec, of course, systemic racism, statistic after statistic, continue to show that if I'm talking about the Chinese community in general, that we suffer larger percentages of poverty, of exclusion, of right to health care, of incomes, et cetera, of housing rights, et cetera. And so in order to deal with systemic racism, in 2017, when the Liberal government announced that they were going to conduct a public consultation on systemic discrimination, the Chinese community, along with many Asian communities and a broad cross-section of, I think there were over 160 organizations in Quebec, which decided that they would participate in this consultation. And so in terms of addressing systemic discrimination, the need was still very much alive. And what happened with the COVID crisis is that the anti-Chinese racism that had always been simmering for over a century continued to exist. And the COVID crisis just it was like, what do you call it, piercing a wound, and Chinese, not just Chinese, but Asians across Canada, and including Indigenous people who sometimes were mistaken for Chinese, were attacked, insulted, humiliated. And so this is what happened. You know, but again, the Chinese community, the Asian communities across the country were very quick to try to reignite a consultation. They tried to, or actually not just that they tried, but they did create a Pan-Asian coalition in order to share experiences. The Canadian National, the Chinese Canadian National Council Social Justice Committee in Toronto did a poll which revealed the extent to which anti-racism existed across the country. There was an organization called Act to End Racism, initiated by organizations in the west of Canada, which denounced racist declarations against Theresa Tam by, I think it was a conservative candidate for the conservative leadership. And so, you know, the obligation to always be on guard, always be ready to defend ourselves, and always be ready to fight back and to claim our place in society is always there. But you know, what I really would like to also mention is the challenges in building coalition and building networks, not just in the Asian community, but I think across minority or racialized communities, because actually the coalitions had always been fragile. If you, I would highly recommend a book by William Deere. I have it in the back of me, sitting on the table in back of me, and he goes through the history and the challenges of trying to form a coalition when, even in the Chinese community, for example, there are so many differences, class differences, status differences, not everybody comes with the same perspective. In the case of the head tax campaign, it was what we call the Lausan Collective, the first generation, the older Cantonese-speaking immigrants, and activists who were younger, more mobile, professionals, recent immigrants from Hong Kong. And it's really interesting in terms of trying to build a united front of people with various different interests and different positions. In terms of the COVID, the reaction to the COVID crisis, there were also, I would say, important differences in political understanding, analysis, and also interest that, again, impacted on the ability of the Chinese Canadian community to be able to forge a united front. So, for example, one divisive issue that came to light was police, because there were organizations that wanted to fight back and give resources to the community who experienced anti-Chinese assaults. And one of their recourses, of course, would be call the police. We have to work with the police. And that didn't go very well with Chinese Canadians and Chinese Quebecers who were in solidarity with Indigenous peoples and with Black Lives Matter, and who were in the camp of defunding the police, and who were aware of the historical place that the police played in, for example, arresting people with no status, who were aware of the fact that actually in the States, the police, and I think even in Canada, the police originally, one of their functions was to bring back runaway slaves. And of course, a Royal Commission, public report after public report, revealed the role of the police, the failures of the police to defend the rights of Indigenous peoples. And so, so there were these different understandings and different political positions that I think that tempered a lot our ability to able to really forge a united front. And I think that these are ongoing conversations that the community will have to continue. We have to really share our knowledge and our resources. So yeah, basically, I think that's what I would like to share today. One really interesting recent initiative that has tried to build like a common understanding in the Chinese community about the intersection of oppressions and the obligation to be in solidarity with other oppressed communities would be, in the past few years, across North America, different Chinese communities have created launched Save Chinatown campaigns. And what is really interesting is that a lot of these activists are unpaid. And almost like around the same time, we all realized that, hey, if we don't do something, Chinatown, we will lose our Chinatown, which, in most cities, they're really important historic, they're really important historic and cultural symbols, and really crucial to the Chinese American or Chinese Canadian identity. And so these, in different cities, and there's a North American network of organizations fighting to save Chinatown, and folded into the issues of Save Chinatown would, of course, be fights against tenant evictions, fights against gentrification, demanding more social services, demanding cultural space, In Montreal's Chinatown, now that we've lost the YMCA, we folded into into a demand to get sports or physical activities installations back into Chinatown, and so that is really interesting. And like I said, this is I would say it's a strong, politically, it's a very strong network, and I think that is gaining strength. And so the other interesting thing about this is that, so again, going back to COVID, yesterday there was a press conference by Chinese merchants who are asking the government, like the three levels of government, to save Chinatown businesses who have been really hard hit by the COVID crisis. And we're afraid that, Chinatown is literally slowly dying out economically. And of course, we in the Save Chinatown coalitions fully support the merchants' demands, but at the same time, if we put that into historical perspective, in fact, Chinatowns across North America have been slowly dying by attrition, and they've been threatened by huge development. If I can just speak briefly about Chinatown in Montreal, Chinatown used to be much, much bigger. And according to researchers, the reason why Chinatown has been reduced to the size that it is today was because bureaucrats thought that, the Chinese community, they're not going to be able to make much noise. They're not going to be able to protest as much if we encroach on their space. And so that's why Chinatown is so tiny. We're limited by the Guy Favreau, by the highway. There was a horrible bylaw also that prohibited the establishment of new businesses beyond Saint-Dominique. I can't remember if I mentioned the Guy Favreau Hydro-Quebec building. And actually last year, what happened was that we had a press conference to try to get the governments to help us to get back the cultural center. It's the only cultural center that we have in the Chinese community in Quebec, and we had wanted to save that. But since it had been bought by private interests, we started to try to search for alternative buildings. And then we realized that, whoa, there are all these huge developments in Chinatown, and nobody knows who's making the decisions. And we rallied the community to demand a development plan to protect Chinatown. And again, the people who are involved in these Save Chinatown projects are people who are very conscious that we're on colonized land, and that Chinatown itself also has to be shared. So for example, finally the city did acquiesce to our demand for public consultation on the development of Chinatown. And again, class interests and privileges, different privilege approaches formed. So for example, in one consultation, I believe that somebody had complained about the homeless people in Chinatown, and well, the homeless people are majoritarily Indigenous peoples who are there. And so, but then, because it was a public consultation, we're able to bring that angle into the consultation, and then, those voices dissipated. So it was really important venue to share our different perspectives. And I think that also, we also reached out in Montreal anyway. We reached out to other neighborhoods that are losing affordable housing due to gentrification, and so we were able to build alliances across race and cultural and language divides. And I have a lot of hope that this could be a model for mobilizing. I think the lessons for effective mobilization within the community would be to build coalitions with other press groups and other minority groups. We see how really how easily it is for the government to divide and conquer. If I can go back to the head tax redress campaign, it took a long time because, like I said, there were difference in positions of organizations that were all working for redress. There were positions or demands that were more conservative, and then there were demands that were bolder and more in line with hardline reparative justice. And it was so easy. You know, we learned from 20 years of lobbying the federal government that was so easy for politicians to say, well, you know, you have to get you have to build a consensus among your community, which itself is extremely racist because white communities don't need to have a consensus on every single issue before advances or progress is made. But this is the world that we live in. We are a minority, and so we do have to build. I would say have minimum build. Sorry, I would have to say that we have to build minimum positions of unity in order to be able to fight racism and different forms of oppression. We have to also, I would say, if I'm addressing Chinese community, I would also have to say that we need to fight our own internalized racism. We benefit from the myth of the model minority. Actually, we could benefit, but we could also suffer from that myth because those who don't fit into the myth can fall through the cracks. But I think that we should never, and the COVID crisis taught this to us, just because you have money, you have education, you're a profession, as long as you're a visible minority, all that can become meaningless, can be in a matter of seconds when racism rears its ugly head and there's a scapegoat that is needed by people who are in positions of power. And so we need to fight our own internalized racism. We need to build solidarity with non-Chinese groups who are fighting for the same basic fundamental rights that we have, which is the right for, again, fighting against poverty, fighting for the right to health care, fighting for housing rights, fighting for status, fighting for equal dignity as everyone else. We also, and we do need to also build coalitions with other groups that are fighting for things that may be specific to them, because at one point, at one point in time, a concern of another group may not, even though it may not be directly relevant to us, again, just by virtue of being a visible minority, we never know when the situation will change. And again, racism, discrimination, anybody could be a victim, and that's why it's so important to put a limit as soon as it is expressed. We have to put a stop to it. And this is one of the lessons actually we learned inside the Chinese community with respect to Islamophobia. If I can just talk about something that happened in the Chinese community, the event was called the hijab hoax. So a couple of years ago, an 11-year-old Muslim girl had invented a story about an Asian man who tried to cut her hijab. She's an 11-year-old kid. 11-year-old, like, children make up things, or they misunderstand things. Sometimes they say things that are not true. But what happened was that this galvanized the entire Chinese community across the country to be demonstrating against Muslims. And it was really politicized by the Conservative Party in order to instrumentalize the Chinese community for partisan purposes. We were shocked in Montreal because there was a demonstration by the Chinese community against Muslims on the eve of the first anniversary of the killings in Quebec City, at the mosque in Quebec City. And so we had to mobilize very quickly. We got in touch with progressive groups in Toronto, and we put out public statements to denounce these demonstrations and to say that this by far did not represent all of the Chinese community. And even more disturbing was that the Islamophobic sections of the Chinese community had hooked up with Storm Alliance, La Mute, all these fascist groups to come out against the Muslim community. And so, see what happens? 2 years later, bam, this racism against Muslims is now turned into racism against Chinese. So even out of self-interest, that's why we have to always be in solidarity against all forms of discrimination and all forms of oppression. So that's my advice for our own community. In terms of people who are outside the community, I would say that it's really important for non-minorities, or let's say for white people, to take ownership of the fact that we do live in a society of white supremacy. It's not just a society. Historically, countries, nations have been built on white supremacy. We have to take ownership of that fact. And I think that each of us also have an individual responsibility to call out racism and discrimination whenever, if it occurs within your ability to witness it, but also to understand that we have to denounce and dismantle systems of oppression. And the reason why I say that is that sometimes I'm really surprised. I would talk to people who I think might be white allies because they seem to be feminists or anti-racist or whatever. And then when I talk about white supremacy, I've gotten reactions where people take it personally. and that had really surprised me, because when I'm talking about politics and systems of oppression, I'm not singling out individuals, and that's where we can go wrong. This is where identity politics could fragilize our ability to build coalitions and to unite. And I think that we have to be careful about that. Yeah, so basically that would be my main suggestions on how to fight back.